Senator Lankford, would you want to make a comment?
I would just only make a brief comment. One is to thank the chairman for holding this hearing. This is a tremendous amount of money that needs some accountability and oversight. This started with a dream and a purpose to say, what are we doing to be able to help in counter narcotics? What are we doing to help stabilize a region of the world that's incredibly important to us, that we are geographically close to, but also relationally close to, with many people that are Americans that have their heritage in Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. But also, what are we doing with immigration? We saw a flood of immigration starting in 2014 from this particular region that came into our country illegally. The countries in that area all raised their hand and said, we want our citizens to stay home. We don't want them to run to another country. We want to have a stable environment here. It is to our benefit to be able to have a stable Central America. We want an ongoing trade partner in that area. We want ongoing relationships. This is in our hemisphere, and we should take this to account. So these three nations have worked to be able to cooperate together economically. They are democracies that are passionate about serving their own people and about staying connected to our country, and I think it's right that we pay attention. But every tax dollar that's put in place, whether it's a tax dollar they're spending locally, they should be able to show people in their own nation how they're gaining value. We should certainly be able to do that for American citizens as well, and saying, is the money that we're being spent just throwing money and saying we did something, or what can we show that we accomplished? So the metrics of it will be exceptionally important in the days ahead to say millions of dollars were spent, this is what the American taxpayer got from it, and this is how it affected the families and the communities there in Central America as well. So I look forward to this conversation, and I would assume within the hour we will solve all of those problems.
Or at least try.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing. Can anyone tell me America's long-term foreign policy objective that is achieved, or even short-term foreign policy objective that is achieved by investing more in the Northern Triangle? When we explain to the American taxpayer, we should invest in Central America, we should say we should invest in these three countries because this is the outcome for Americans. What would you say that is? And anyone can jump in there.
Well, I think, and actually some of this reasoning pertained to our internal debate almost 30 years ago when we talked about NAFTA and what interest we had in negotiating an economic integration arrangement with Mexico, that it would help improve local economic conditions so that the incentives to migrate in an undocumented and an illicit fashion would be diminished. I think it could also help some of the other measures in the area of rule of law and so forth in reducing transnational crime.
Okay.
I think it's a question of the geographic proximity of Central America gives us an immediate interest in what is happening in those countries.
Okay. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I would say, particularly after 2014, there was a tremendous attention in the, here in Washington and in the country with regards to the unaccompanied minors humanitarian crisis. I think the best way for the United States to, support the region is to focus on figuring out how do we address the conditions that led many people to flee their homes and their communities in the first place.
So, both of you say illegal immigration. We benefit what's happening here by engaging there. That helps us with immigration issues. It helps us with economic activity. I've heard that several times. And narcotics or human trafficking. Those three things in specific. Anyone else add to something on that?
If I can briefly add, I think it supports our values as Americans as well. And the United States has had a long history in Central America. And the idea of us coming alongside Central Americans themselves to try to improve their own conditions, their own democracy, their own markets, I think is an important use of the United States political will.
Right. So then the challenge is, how do we actually keep the projects narrow enough that we're focused in on things and things that have enough metrics that we can achieve them? I spoke to General Kelly this week. He was very involved in the origination of the Alliance for Prosperity at the earliest stages. When he was at Southcom, And with what happened with State Department at that point, obviously is at DHS at this point. Mr. Farnsworth, I believe you had mentioned the conference that's happening in about 3 weeks in Miami with all these nations together with Mexico and with us to be able to communicate what can we do on that. Those are all very important things. But what was interesting is, speaking to General Kelly, the concern at the very beginning for this focus in Central America was trying to make sure there are achievable things that Americans do well. And he gave a quick for instance. We know on immunizations, for instance, if we engage on immunizations in certain regions of the world, we know we watch disease drop, we do that well, we do distribution well, we can engage and we can achieve that. The focus on this seems to be so broad so quickly. There are so many areas of need. It doesn't look like we're engaging. It looks like we're engaging in everything rather than in narrow things to be able to achieve things that we know, number one, we do well, and number two, that we can measure and track and know that they're staying on focus. And I don't want this conversation to be about this topic, but I just bring this up as an example. Of the $750 million that we did last year, $57 million of that was on climate change work in Central America. Now, again, there are many people that see a high value in investing in that, but when we're talking about the desperate need in Central America at that point, 10,000 homes, finding ways to have alternative energy in 10,000 homes in Central America may not rise to the highest level of what we've got to do first to help stabilize a community and to help engage. Now, I'm not, again, arguing it's not something that's important, but I'm asking, is it first priority? Last year it was. It was 57 million of the 750 million that was done. I want to ask the question, how do we get us on focus so that 2 years from now, we look back on it and go, these are the things we achieved. So my general question is, and I'd love to be able to do a second round if that's possible. My general question is, what are the things that Americans do well that we should partner well with them that has specific metrics that we can look back on in the years ahead and go, we invested this dollar here, we partnered in this way, and here's how we achieved it. Any quick ideas on that?
Yeah, Senator, I agree completely with your emphasis on a narrow focus. We can't try to do everything. I also agree on the importance of stronger metrics and a results-based framework. I would push just a touch on the part of what America does well in the implication that, for instance, in vaccines and vaccine delivery, and I think we want to go a little bit beyond just delivering vaccines, and I think we want to go beyond. What we need to do is make sure that these countries are capable of doing that for themselves, which is a bigger challenge, frankly.
Right, and I agree completely. I'm just saying that's one that's a very clear metric to be able to look at and go, we did this, this is what happened in disease in that particular. Now, it's not even a Central America issue. That's typically an Africa issue for that.
Good. Okay. And so I think, using the constraints analysis that we've done at MCC, and the analysis that the Atlantic Council has done. There's a lot of diagnostic out there, and I think there's a fairly narrow list of problems in terms of security is certainly one, prosperity that's underlined by education, and particularly secondary education leads into both problems in security and prosperity. Right. I think that's an important area to focus on. And then the underlying governance, which isn't just controlling corruption, it's also building the capacity in these line ministries to better deliver these services for these countries. And that's an area where we, as the U.S. government, I think need to be a little bit more forward-leaning.
So what does that look like when you talk about security? I just want to press on that one issue.
Okay.
What can we do to actually help security that we can measure and track and we know we're investing in?
Okay. So in security, which is an area outside of MCC in which USAID and State Department through INL are more engaged, they're engaged on things such as community policing. They're working with the prosecutors to improve their ability to both investigate and prosecute cases. But that's an area that I would turn more towards other members of the panel that are more familiar with security, because MCC, due to our mandate, is focused more on the prosperity aspects and the things that underlie that, as well as governance.
So in our report, we talk about prison reform, targeting high-risk neighborhoods for increased social and educational programs. We have several specific things: improving police accountability. I think security and rule of law. If I was going to say what are the real priorities for this program, our program, this national program towards Central America, I think that's where it ought to be.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I know if there's going to be a second round, I can hold this back and we can move on and get a chance, and I'll come back to that.
Just hold that thought, and then we'll take it up. Senator Shaheen. Senator Lankford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how are we interacting at this point, and what role would you place on local leaders? Obviously, there are elected officials in each of these countries that are great partners for us. They're passionate about their country and care for their country. What balance should there be between American tax dollars coming to be able to invest in key areas and ways that we can partner together, and those local leaders, elected officials there, saying this is where you could help us the most? How do we marry those two together so that we're not doing projects and they're saying that's fine, but that's not our greatest area of need? So what do you see already? Where have you seen the success in that, in discovering the issues from the local leaders?
Mr. Senator, if I could start with a couple comments. The first is that if we're serious about Central America taking the lead in its own development and solving its own problems, we have to allow them to do that.
Right.
And so part of that is allowing them to actually develop the plan that we can then come alongside and choose what part or parts to fund and underwrite based on our own interests. So I
Do you
think,
feel like that's happening now, or do you feel like once we voted, there was a rapid pursuit to be able to get dollars out the door to be able to do something? Or was there a strategic working with individual leaders there?
I think that there is a combination of all of the above, to be honest. And there was also, in the context of Central Americans creating this plan, there was always an eye to Washington in terms of what the anticipation might be that we would fund anyway. So as that plan was being put together, it was not done in a vacuum. So I think that's the first part. But the second part pertains to our delivery of assistance. I think we can use some creativity here. So for example, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, instead of just dividing a package by 3 and saying this is the amount that we'll provide for you, come up with a way to spend it, this is the amount for you, et cetera, why don't we think more creatively and say, okay, this is the plan that you're committed to, this is the plan that you're committed to, it's not the same plan, it's a national plan, that's great, we will fund a certain percentage, and then once you've completed that plan, if you're the first mover on this, why not have the ability to compete for a greater amount of the overall
A bonus.
package? Absolutely.
Right.
And I don't know if it's politically correct to use this phrase, but it's really a race to the top.
Right.
In the context of getting the 3 countries, again, with their own national commitments. So we're not imposing anything, but we're saying, if you meet your commitments first, if it's verifiable, if it's audited, if it's consistent with what we thought we agreed to do, you can get 50% of the overall budget. Or you can get 40, or whatever it is. I'm not suggesting that I have the wisdom here. But that would change the dynamic, because it would then cause the leaders of those countries to take these commitments seriously and to say, we have a chance to compete for double our funding or whatever it is. I think that would have an important incentivizing effect.
Okay. Ms. Beltran, were you wanting to add to that? Looked like you were leaning towards the microphone there.
No, thank you, Senator. Just to add, I think the importance of having a very clear strategy and outcomes is key. I think one of the issues, of why past assistance has not been as effective is, how are we defining outcomes?
Right.
In the area where I work is how are we defining institutional strengthening, and what do we mean by having an effective justice system, and work backwards and establish very, very clear metrics. I think there are opportunities, spaces of opportunities in each of the 3 countries regarding rule of law, and it's how we can better support the efforts of those that are really seeking lasting reforms in these countries.
Yeah, I saw some of the outcomes and the specific things that y'all had articulated, and I think those are very, very beneficial. Ambassador?
Yeah, one point I'd like to add, just because I've served in so many different parts of the world, Senator, is that relationships in Latin America between for the United States are very close. These are people whose languages we understand, we can speak them. It's not like being in Iraq or Vietnam, both of which countries I've served in, where the relationship, I'm not saying it was not friendly or close, but it was a little more arm's length than it would be in a situation like Latin America. So when you're doing a community policing initiative or one of these model precinct programs, or you're doing something that Ambassador Brownfield is carrying out under his international narcotics and law enforcement, these are close relationships. We're not just writing a check and walking away. I think we have good close-up observation of what's going on.
I would agree, and it's something you and I have spoken about before. I would suggest that as a gain for us, some of the partner cities that we've had before and partner police departments in the United States partnering with some of the local law enforcement in each of these countries to develop lasting relationships to where when there is an issue there and they feel like they can't call someone locally, they do have someone outside the country they can call and say, I'm seeing this, I'm experiencing this, what would you suggest? That only happens with relationships and with engaging, and those are things that we can bring to bear. We have excellent law enforcement border to border across the country. We have a lot of departments that would be a tremendous asset. Our FBI, those in the FBI Academy, there's a tremendous amount of gain that we could share from inside things that we have tested for a long time that I think would be an asset in local law enforcement. So it's not just a matter of sending a contractor down to train, but that's we actually send people back and forth and develop those relationships. Mr. Farnsworth, you had mentioned before as well about CAFTA and about some of the relationships there, that it's still easier for many of those countries to do business with the United States or with Mexico than it is with one of the countries that literally they border to. How does that ever get resolved to create an economic zone there?
It's a really important question, and one of the missed opportunities of Central America over the past 15 years has been precisely that point, where the countries which are parties to CAFTA saw this in some ways as guaranteed access to the United States rather than the opportunity to really develop their own trade relationships with their neighbors. And the World Bank, for example, has done some really interesting work recently about the gains from trade and what that means for national incomes if you do more to trade with your neighbors. First of all, it starts with an attitude of desire to do that. There's still history there. There's still politics there between countries, and they're not always the best of political allies necessarily, so that's number one. It requires a mind shift just to do it. Number two, there are some pragmatic realities on the ground in Central America. For example, borders. Borders don't work in Central America. They're incredibly difficult to cross, whether you're a pedestrian, whether you're a trucker, whether you're whatever you are. That impedes commerce. It also enables corruption, and it makes these countries simply less productive. That's not simply a matter of law enforcement. It's also a matter of infrastructure, which is a really big issue. But one of the areas, for example, that the United States can contribute to in terms of improving the scenario and would be beneficial to address the issue you've raised, Mr. Senator, is the idea of trade facilitation in terms of customs procedures and in terms of allowing and helping trade actually to be done better in the Central American countries. What you don't have is the idea yet that's developed everywhere else globally, or many other places globally, is the idea of supply chains. And that is the next logical area of production, and it makes a lot of sense, linking to Mexico, linking to the United States. So now, instead of the hub and spoke method, where you produce something in Central America, you export it to the United States, now you see each other as a more integrated economic space, and you produce things together. That breaks down some of these barriers we've been talking about, but it requires a political commitment at the top to really go in this direction. I think the United States can help facilitate that, but ultimately the region has to decide that's the direction it wants to go.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate your indulgence very much in this and to be able to go through it and for holding this hearing. I think our relationship with these three countries really is very strategic to us. There are so many Americans that trace their lineage back to these three countries. There's so much commerce that could go back and forth between us. There's a clear connection in illegal immigration to these three countries and what happens there, both economically, crime, corruption within governments, lack of access to courts and such, that's very significant. And the narcotics trafficking that they're caught in the middle of. That starts in South America, and they're only the midpoint. And a lot of that government corruption is based on narcotics trafficking through them, that Americans are the buyers, and they're merely the waypoint in it, and they're affected by what's happening here. So there are some significant relationships where I think they expect us to step up and to say, you're helping create this problem in Central America based on the drug purchasing happening in the United States and their trafficking point that they want to engage. Quite frankly, all three of these countries are friends. They're allies of ours that we have a lot of common relationships with. And what I've seen, and we just mentioned it several times, Ms. Beltran's mentioned it with Guatemala, and specifically what President Morales has done and what Thelma Aldana, their Attorney General, has done has been remarkable to be able to see their aggressive focus on trying to deal with corruption that has been historic there and to be able to turn that around. I think we should reward that, and I think we should lean in and engage in a way that continues to support them. What I would hope in this is that how we do oversight and metrics on these three countries and what we do with our foreign aid becomes a model with how we handle foreign aid all over the world. that because of our partnership and our relationship, we start asking the hard question: what are the metrics? What are we good at? Are we putting money towards something because there's a problem, or are we helping solve something so that both countries at the end of it see a success? And I think it can be done with this kind of focus on it. And so I very much appreciate your engagement in this.